On my wedding night, I watched my father-in-law brutalize my mother-in-law. I rushed in to save her, and my new husband slapped me across the face. He told me to know my place, so I broke 3 of his fingers and dragged his bleeding mother to the hospital. The next morning, they tried to strip me of everything I owned. They had no idea they just handed the match to the woman who was about to burn their entire empire to the ground. Before I tell you how I dismantled a billionaire real estate dynasty from the inside out, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant family exactly who they are dealing with. My name is Camille, and I am 32 years old. An hour ago, I was standing at an altar, draped in thousands of imported white orchids, repeating sacred vows to a man I truly believed was my equal in every way. Now I am standing in a luxurious country club bathroom, wiping my own blood off my mouth with the back of my trembling hand. The transition from a perfect fairy tale wedding reception to a violent crime scene happened in less than 60 seconds. The grand ballroom of the Oak Creek Country Club was vibrating with the joyous sound of a 9-piece jazz band and the booming laughter of 400 of the city's most elite and wealthy residents. I had just slipped away from the extravagant head table to fix my lipstick and catch my breath in the VIP bridal suite located down a quiet, secluded mahogany-paneled hallway. I pushed open the heavy oak door, completely expecting a moment of serene quiet. Instead, I was met with a scene that will remain permanently burned into my memory. I heard the sickening and unmistakable thud of human bone hitting hard glass. Calvin stood right in the center of the lavishly decorated room. He was my new father-in-law, the man who owned practically half the commercial real estate in the entire metropolitan area. The man whose pristine public image painted him as a devout pillar of the community, a generous philanthropist, and a champion of urban development. Right now, his massive hands were wrapped tightly around the throat of his wife Loretta. He shoved her backward with a terrifying and practiced force. Loretta's spine slammed violently against the edge of the custom-built glass vanity table. The thick mirror above it shattered instantly, raining jagged, sharp shards across the polished marble floor. She crumpled to the ground, coughing violently and clutching her side, while Calvin stood towering over her, calmly adjusting the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo jacket. I did not scream. I did not gasp or freeze in a state of panic. Working for years as a forensic auditor, tracking the dirty money of incredibly dangerous men trains you to keep your heart rate remarkably steady under extreme pressure. I dropped my custom floral bouquet, let my expensive designer clutch hit the floor, and I launched myself entirely across the room. I tackled a man who was easily twice my size and weight, driving my shoulder straight into his ribs with everything I had. The sudden impact knocked Calvin completely off balance, sending him crashing backward into a plush velvet sofa. Loretta was gasping for air on the floor, with dark blood pooling on the delicate lace collar of her silver evening gown. I knelt quickly beside her, assessing the immediate damage. Before I could even check her pulse, the suite door flew wide open, hitting the wall with a loud bang. It was Trey, my husband of exactly 3 hours. I looked up at him, fully expecting him to rush to his mother's aid or help me physically restrain his out-of-control father. I expected righteous outrage. I expected a protector. Instead, Trey crossed the room in 3 massive, heavy strides, grabbed me aggressively by the shoulder, and slapped me incredibly hard across the face. The sheer force of his heavy hand snapping against my cheekbone sent me reeling backward into the wall. The warm, metallic taste of copper filled my mouth instantly as my lips split open against my teeth. I caught my balance against the doorframe, staring at him in absolute disbelief. Trey was not even looking at his bleeding mother sobbing on the floor. He was looking at his father with an expression of terrified, pathetic subservience. Then he turned his eyes back to me, his face contorted in an ugly, vicious sneer. "Know your place, Camille. You do not ever touch my father." I wiped the blood from my split lip very slowly. I looked at the man I had just promised to spend the rest of my life with. The charismatic, smooth-talking junior executive who had promised me a partnership in every sense of the word. The man who successfully hid his deep-rooted cowardice behind expensive tailored suits and his father's immense generational wealth. I realized in that single heartbeat that I was entirely in enemy territory. I had not married into a prestigious family. I had married into a ruthless cartel. I did not cry. Crying is a luxury reserved for people who have reliable safety nets to fall back on. Growing up constantly bouncing between overcrowded group homes and harsh foster care placements in the roughest parts of the city taught me a very long time ago that tears do not stop a fist, and they certainly do not buy you any freedom. You either learn exactly how to dismantle the immediate threat in front of you, or you become a permanent helpless victim. I chose the former a long time ago. Trey stepped toward me again, his chest puffed out, fueled by the toxic, sick validation he thought he was actively earning from his abusive father. He reached out and grabbed my shoulder roughly, his fingers digging painfully into my skin, intending to forcefully pull me out of the suite and sweep this entire horrific incident under the rug to protect their image. He made a fatal miscalculation. He completely forgot who I was before I put on this expensive designer wedding dress. I shifted my weight seamlessly, planting my heels firmly into the marble floor. I brought my left arm up in a swift motion, trapping his wrist tightly against my collarbone. With my right hand, I grabbed his extended fingers, isolating his index, middle, and ring fingers in a vice grip. I stepped directly into his personal space, twisting his hand backward at an entirely unnatural angle, applying my entire body weight into the specialized joint manipulation hold I had learned in self-defense classes years prior. I did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. I snapped his fingers backward until I felt the bone and thick cartilage give way. The sickening pop echoed loudly in the quiet suite. Trey immediately dropped to his knee, his arrogant sneer dissolving into a high-pitched wailing scream of absolute agony. He cradled his mangled hand against his chest, rocking back and forth on the floor, sobbing like a child. Calvin was just getting to his feet, his eyes wide with genuine shock at what I had just done to his golden child. I took a threatening step toward me, his massive fists balled at his sides, but I held my ground, glaring right through him with a look of pure lethal intent. I dared him silently to try it. He stopped dead in his tracks. I turned my back on both of these pathetic men and knelt beside Loretta. She was only semi-conscious, holding her face, while her orbital bone was already swelling into a grotesque and terrifying shade of purple. I wrapped her arm securely over my shoulder, hauled her up from the broken glass, and supported her dead weight entirely against my side. "Do not look at them," I told her calmly, keeping my voice remarkably steady. "Just keep walking with me." I kicked the suite door open with my foot. I marched straight out into the main decorated corridor, supporting my severely battered mother-in-law. We walked directly through the grand foyer, right past the open double doors of the main ballroom. 400 wealthy guests stopped mid-sentence. The jazz band faltered, missed a beat, and completely died out. The city's elite stood frozen, holding their expensive champagne flutes, staring in absolute horror as the bride marched past them in a blood-stained Vera Wang gown, dragging the matriarch of the family, whose face was covered in crimson blood. I did not offer a single explanation to the gaping crowd. I kicked the main entrance doors open and walked out into the humid night air. The valet stared in utter shock, but I tossed him my ticket and ordered him to bring my car immediately with a voice that brooked no argument. Within seconds, my sedan pulled up to the curb. I practically threw Loretta into the passenger seat, securing her belt, and jumped behind the wheel. As I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot heavily on the accelerator, I checked my rearview mirror. Calvin's private security guards were sprinting frantically out of the venue doors, pointing directly at my taillights and shouting furiously into their radios. I gripped the steering wheel, peeling out of the country club gates and disappearing rapidly into the dark night. I drove erratically, but with pinpoint clinical precision, running 2 red lights to get to the nearest trauma center as fast as the engine would allow. When I slammed the brakes outside the brightly lit emergency room doors, I laid on the horn continuously until a triage team rushed out with a rolling gurney. They took one horrified look at Loretta's battered face and the fresh blood soaking entirely through my expensive wedding dress, and immediately rushed her inside the building. I followed close behind, answering their rapid-fire medical questions with complete emotional detachment. They wheeled her swiftly into an emergency trauma bay. A doctor took me aside and grimly informed me she had a severely fractured orbital bone, significant internal bruising, and possible rib fractures from the impact. They needed to take her into emergency surgery immediately to relieve the dangerous pressure building around her eye and stabilize her breathing. I stood alone in the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lighting of the waiting room, the adrenaline slowly receding from my veins, leaving a cold, calculating fury in its place. My phone buzzed loudly in the pocket of my coat. I pulled it out. The bright screen lit up with a text message from Trey. I expected anger or apologies or perhaps sheer panic. Instead, I received a calculated threat crafted with the clinical precision of a family, entirely used to crushing people who stepped out of line. "You are dead to this family," it read. "I am freezing all our joint accounts right now, and I am calling my lawyers. You leave with absolutely nothing. Do not ever show your face near us again." I read the text twice. I did not type a response. I just locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. He actually thought freezing a domestic joint account would bring me to my knees begging for mercy. He thought I was just some local corporate accountant who had hit the jackpot by marrying into his wealthy, influential family. He had absolutely no idea that for the past 6 years I had been operating as a highly classified ghost auditor for a massive federal financial crimes task force, tracking illicit cartel funds across complex global networks. A frozen domestic bank account was a minor, laughable inconvenience to me. I walked back into the sterile pre-op area where the rushing nurses were prepping Loretta for her emergency surgery. They were about to administer the heavy pain medication to sedate her completely. I walked up to her bedside and took her uninjured hand gently in mine. She looked up at me, her good eye focusing through the immense pain she was enduring. Her breathing was shallow, but her grip on my fingers was surprisingly strong. She reached painfully into the torn neckline of her ruined evening gown and pulled out a heavy titanium-encrypted flash drive attached to a delicate silver chain. Her hands were shaking violently as she unclasped it and shoved the cold, heavy metal directly into my palm. She closed my fingers over it, holding my fist incredibly tight. The nurses were telling me I needed to step back immediately, but Loretta stubbornly refused to let go of my hand. She pulled me down toward her so she could speak directly into my ear. Her voice was raspy, broken by the severe trauma to her throat, but the absolute conviction in it was terrifyingly clear. "They think they own everything," she whispered, her eyes burning with decades of suppressed violent rage. "I have been watching him for 20 years. I have been saving every single file, every hidden offshore account, every stolen dollar from this community. I waited so long for someone strong enough to help me." The heart monitors began to beep rapidly as the heavy medication hit her bloodstream. Her eyes started to flutter shut, but she grabbed my collar with her last ounce of strength, pulling me down one last time. "Burn them, Camille. Burn it all to the ground." The nurses finally ushered me out of the room as Loretta lost consciousness completely. I stood entirely alone in the sterile white hallway, the heavy titanium drive pressing deeply into the palm of my hand. It was freezing cold against my warm skin. I looked down at my hands, still deeply stained with the blood of the woman who had just handed me the digital keys to her abusive husband's total destruction. I took a deep breath, letting the reality of my ruined wedding night wash over me. Trey thought he could threaten me with expensive lawyers and frozen accounts. Calvin thought he could brutally beat his wife and intimidate me into silent compliance. They wanted a war. I slid the flash drive securely into my pocket, walking toward the hospital exit with a perfectly steady heart rate. I was going to give them one. On my wedding night, I watched my father-in-law brutalize my mother-in-law. I rushed in to save her, and my new husband slapped me across the face. He told me to know my place, so I broke 3 of his fingers and dragged his bleeding mother to the hospital. The next morning, they tried to strip me of everything I owned. They had no idea they just handed the match to the woman who was about to burn their entire empire to the ground. The cold titanium flash drive burned against my palm as I stepped out of the surgical wing and into the sterile glare of the main hospital lobby. The heavy double doors had barely slid shut behind me when the quiet hum of the waiting room was shattered by the sound of heavy dress shoes slamming against the linoleum. I did not need to look up to know the cavalry had arrived. Calvin marched through the automatic entrance with the sheer, arrogant force of a man who owned the building. Flanking him were 2 massive private security contractors in dark suits. Right behind them strode his eldest son Andre, looking identically furious, and Andre's wife Chloe. Chloe marched straight toward me, the diamonds at her throat catching the harsh hospital lighting. Her heels clicked sharply, echoing her extreme entitlement. She stopped inches from my face, her nose wrinkled in absolute disgust. This is exactly why Calvin said Trey should never marry out of his tax bracket. She spat, her voice dripping with venom. You people always resort to ghetto violence when you do not get your way. Look at you standing there in a ruined wedding dress like trash. I kept my heart rate steady. I did not raise my voice or take the bait. I simply looked down at Chloe, matching her hostile glare with dead calm calculation. I broke 3 fingers on your brother-in-law's hand because he laid his hands on me, I stated clearly. And his father is currently facing a felony assault charge for nearly killing his own wife. Do not mistake self-defense for ghetto violence, Chloe. And certainly do not project your twisted racial complexes onto me when you married into a family that beats their women into submission. Andre lunged forward, pointing a threatening finger at my face. You listen to me, you gold-digging fraud, he snarled. You do not speak to my wife that way. We are going into that ICU right now, and we are getting my mother out of this public facility. She is transferring to our private doctor immediately. He signaled to the 2 bodyguards, who immediately stepped forward to push me aside. They intended to physically bulldoze their way into the restricted surgical wing to silence Loretta before she could wake up and speak to the police. I planted my feet squarely in the center of the double doors, blocking the only entry point to the intensive care unit. Calvin stepped up, placing a heavy hand on Andre's chest to silence him. The older man glared down at me, his eyes cold and devoid of any humanity. Move aside, Camille. Calvin ordered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You are way out of your depth. I will have your accounting license permanently revoked by Monday morning. I will call every firm in this state and make sure you cannot even get a job balancing a cash register. Now step away from those doors before I have you arrested for kidnapping. I reached into the hidden pocket of my ruined gown. I did not flinch at his threats. Instead, I pulled out a neatly folded piece of legal paper, heavily embossed with a state notary seal. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases, and held it up right in front of Calvin's face. 10 minutes before I walked down the aisle today, Loretta and I slipped into the bridal suite to sign this, I told him, watching the color drain entirely from his arrogant face. It is a fully binding medical proxy and an irrevocable power of attorney. It names me, not you, and not your sons, as her sole legal guardian in the event she is incapacitated. Calvin snatched the paper from my hands, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. The signature was undeniable. The notary stamp was flawless. As her legal medical proxy, I have explicitly instructed the hospital staff that no family members are allowed within 50 feet of her recovery room. I continued, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet lobby. I also flagged her file as a domestic violence protocol. The hospital administration has already notified the local precinct. If you or your goons take one more step toward those doors, the armed police officers currently stationed in the surgical wing will arrest you for violating a federal safety mandate. Andre grabbed the paper from his father, reading it frantically. Chloe let out a sharp, frustrated breath, crossing her arms. This is absurd, she snapped. You manipulated a confused woman right before a wedding. We have lawyers who will tear this apart in 30 seconds. I smiled at her, a cold, humorless expression. Bring them, I challenged. But right now, you are trespassing on a restricted medical floor against the direct orders of the primary medical proxy. I turned to the hospital security desk, where 3 guards had been watching the altercation unfold. Gentlemen, I called out clearly. These people are threatening a patient under a domestic violence hold. Please escort them off the premises immediately. The hospital guards hesitated for only a second before moving in, recognizing the legal authority of the document I held. Calvin's bodyguards tensed, ready for a fight, but Calvin raised a hand, stopping them. I knew creating a physical brawl with hospital security and local police would destroy his carefully crafted public image. Calvin leaned in extremely close to my face. His breath smelled like expensive scotch and pure malice. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with, little girl, he whispered dangerously. You have no money. You have no home. You have no husband. By morning, you will not even exist in this city. You will be wiped clean. I held his gaze, refusing to blink. "We will see about that," I replied quietly. He turned on his heel, marching out of the hospital with his angry family trailing behind him, leaving me alone to guard the doors. I needed my primary work laptop and my secure communication devices. I walked out of the hospital, hailed a taxi, and directed the driver to the luxury downtown penthouse I shared with Trey. The ride was silent, giving me time to mentally catalog every piece of encrypted hardware I needed to extract from that apartment. I was playing a high-stakes game now, and I needed my federal tools. The taxi dropped me off, and I took the private elevator straight up to the top floor. When the elevator doors slid open, I was met with a scene designed strictly for humiliation. Every single piece of my clothing, every pair of shoes, my books, and my personal files had been unceremoniously dumped in the public hallway. My favorite dresses were thrown over the railing, my belongings scattered like garbage. I walked up to the heavy oak front door and pressed my thumb against the biometric smart lock. A red light flashed, indicating access denied. They had completely wiped my biometric data and changed the entry codes. I heard a pathetic mocking laugh coming from the upper balcony. I looked up and saw Trey leaning over the railing. His right hand was heavily wrapped in a temporary splint and cast, clutching a glass of whiskey with his good hand. He looked down at me with absolute contempt, dropping a folded piece of paper over the edge. It fluttered down, landing directly on top of my ruined belongings. "Consider that your formal eviction notice," he sneered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "My father owns this building. You are officially trespassing. Have fun sleeping on the street, Camille." I thought I would cry. He expected me to bang on the door, beg for forgiveness, or plead for access to my own home. He wanted to feel powerful after I had completely humiliated and physically broken him. I did not give him the satisfaction of a single word. I simply looked at him, picked up the fake eviction notice, and tore it neatly in half. I turned around, leaving the pile of expensive clothes and shoes exactly where they were. Material things meant nothing to me. I took the elevator down to the secure underground parking garage where my sedan was parked. I popped the trunk and lifted the false bottom panel, pulling out a heavy black tactical go bag. Inside was my secondary encrypted laptop, untraceable satellite routers, and enough cash to disappear for a month. I sat in the driver's seat, locking the doors. I pulled out the titanium flash drive Loretta had shoved into my hand at the hospital and plugged it directly into my secure terminal. I bypassed the first encryption wall using a brute force decryption key I built for the federal task force. Lines of code began to rapidly cascade down my screen. Folders upon folders of detailed financial records, hidden ledgers, and Shell Corporation manifests began populating my hard drive. I opened the master file and my breath caught in my throat. I saw an endless stream of offshore account numbers routing millions of dollars through unregulated tax havens. They were not just rich. They were running a massive illegal syndicate hiding behind a legitimate real estate facade. I closed the laptop, placing it securely in my bag. Trey thought he had locked me out of my life. He had no idea I had just unlocked the door to his entire family's destruction. The hunters had officially become the hunted. The automatic doors slid shut, cutting off Calvin's empty threats. I did not look back. Panic is a luxury I could not afford, and Calvin was about to learn that taking everything from a woman who built herself from nothing only leaves her with nothing to lose. I walked straight to my car, my mind rapidly cataloging my next steps. I needed my primary work laptop, my secure communication devices, and my physical backup drives. I threw the car into gear and headed toward the downtown luxury penthouse I shared with Trey. The drive was a blur of neon city lights reflecting off my windshield. I replayed the last 3 hours in my head. A normal bride would be in hysterics, mourning the illusion of a perfect marriage. But I was not a normal bride. I was a ghost auditor for the federal government. I spent my days tracing the invisible ink of corrupt billionaires and cartel bosses. Trey's fragile ego and his father's predictable intimidation tactics were nothing I had not seen sitting across an interrogation table. They operated on the assumption that money bought invincibility. They were wrong. I pulled into the private resident garage of our high-rise building and took the express elevator to the penthouse floor. When the brass doors parted, the smell of bleach and expensive cologne hit me first. I stepped out into the private landing and stopped. My entire life, or at least the life Trey knew about, was scattered across the marble floor like garbage. My custom suits were slashed and thrown in a heap. My grandmother's cast iron skillet, the only thing I had left of my bloodline, was sitting on top of my crushed cosmetics. My framed degree from Howard University lay shattered against the baseboard, the glass glittering under the harsh, recessed lighting. They had moved fast. Calvin must have made the call the second I left the country club. I walked up to the heavy mahogany front door and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A harsh red light blinked twice. Access denied. They had wiped my profile from the smart lock system. I heard the distinct sound of the door latch clicking. The heavy door swung open just a few inches, secured by a heavy brass chain lock. Trey stood on the other side, his injured hand heavily bandaged and strapped securely to his chest. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his breathing was shallow, but his face was twisted into a pathetic, arrogant sneer. He leaned his forehead against the doorframe, looking down at my ruined belongings, and then up at me. He told me I was crazy if I really thought I could just walk into his family and take over. His voice was trembling with a mixture of pain and unearned bravado. He bragged that his father built this city and owned the police, the judges, and this very building. He told me I was officially trespassing. I stood perfectly still, looking at the man I had traded vows with just hours ago. He was sweating, his pupils dilated from whatever heavy painkillers the concierge doctor had pumped into his system to deal with the 3 broken fingers I gave him. I did not say a single word. I did not demand to be let in. I did not ask for my winter coat or my toiletries. I simply stared at him with an expression of pure, icy calculation, measuring the exact dimensions of his weakness. Trey mistook my silence for defeat. He chuckled a wet, nervous sound and slid a folded piece of thick legal paper through the crack in the door. It fluttered down, landing directly on the shattered glass of my college degree. He sneered and told me to consider that my formal eviction notice. He bragged that they froze the joint accounts 30 minutes ago and that my credit cards would decline. He threatened that my car would be reported stolen by morning since it was registered to the company trust. He told me to have a nice life back in the gutter and slammed the door, shutting the heavy deadbolt with a loud metallic thud. I looked down at the piece of paper. It was a legally bogus eviction notice typed up hastily without a judge's signature or a 30-day court mandate. It was an intimidation tactic meant to break my spirit and send me running back to them begging for forgiveness. They expected me to pound on the mahogany wood, demanding my clothes and crying over my ruined wedding night. They wanted me to feel the crushing weight of sudden poverty, to remember the foster care system I fought so hard to escape. I did not even pick the paper up. I turned on my heel and stepped back into the elevator, hitting the button for the parking garage. When I reached my car, I popped the trunk. Trey was right about one thing. The sedan was technically registered to his father's corporate fleet, and it would be flagged by morning. But Trey did not know about the false bottom panel in the trunk liner. I pulled the heavy latch, lifting the custom casing. Inside sat a heavy black tactical go bag. I pulled it out, unzipping the main compartment. Inside was my secondary encrypted laptop, 3 untraceable prepaid satellite routers, and a thick envelope containing $20,000 in untraceable cash. I never went anywhere without an exit strategy. You do not survive the foster system, and you certainly do not hunt white-collar criminals for a living without knowing how to vanish in plain sight. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. The parking garage was dead quiet. I pulled the laptop from the bag, resting it on the steering wheel. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy titanium flash drive Loretta had shoved into my hand before passing out in the trauma bay. It was still warm. I plugged the drive into the secure port on my machine. A black terminal window popped up immediately, demanding a 64-character alphanumeric encryption key. Calvin had spared no expense hiding his secrets, but he had underestimated his wife, and he had severely underestimated me. I launched a brute force decryption program I had written for the task force, specifically designed to shatter corporate firewalls. The screen flashed red, then green. The security walls crumbled. A massive cascade of offshore account numbers routed through the Cayman Islands and the Seychelles flooded my screen. Hundreds of shell corporations, dummy charities, and fake real estate holdings scrolled rapidly past my eyes. The sheer volume of the stolen money was staggering. Calvin was not just a corrupt businessman. He was running an active financial syndicate. I closed the laptop, sliding it safely back into my bag. Trey thought he had stripped me bare and locked me out of my life. He had no idea I had just unlocked the door to his entire family's destruction. The hunters were now the hunted. I pulled out of the underground parking garage, leaving Trey and his pathetic eviction notice behind. My rearview mirror showed the towering glass and steel structure of the penthouse we were supposed to share, receding into the dark city skyline. He wanted me to feel the sting of sudden homelessness, to panic at the thought of having my credit cards declined. He did not realize that I spent the first 18 years of my life mastering the art of survival. You do not bounce between 6 different group homes in Southside Chicago without learning how to pack your entire existence into a single duffel bag in under 5 minutes. I drove to the industrial district on the edge of town, far away from the manicured lawns and gated communities where Calvin's influence bought silence. I pulled into the flickering neon lot of a cash-only motel. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass barely glanced at me as I slid a crisp $100 bill under the partition. He handed over a brass key to a room on the second floor. I did not need luxury. I needed a secure grid. The room smelled like stale smoke and industrial cleaner, but the deadbolt was heavy and the curtains were thick blackout material. I dropped my tactical bag on the sagging mattress and immediately went to work. I pulled out my secondary encrypted laptop, plugging it into a portable, untraceable satellite router. I am not just a corporate accountant who crunches quarterly tax returns. For the past 6 years, I have operated as a ghost auditor for a federal financial crimes task force. My job is to bleed the digital veins of corporate syndicates, dry tracking illicit funds across complex global networks. I plugged Loretta's titanium flash drive back into my terminal. The initial decryption had already exposed the outer shell, revealing hundreds of offshore accounts, but Calvin was a paranoid man. The deepest files, the ones detailing the exact origins of his wealth, were locked behind a secondary military-grade encryption wall. I opened my command terminal, executing a specialized brute force algorithm I designed specifically to shatter corporate firewalls. While the code ran, I paced the small room, my mind racing. Calvin's entire reputation was built on his so-called urban development initiatives. He paraded around the city claiming to revitalize lower-income African-American neighborhoods, buying up generational properties, and promising affordable housing. It was the perfect public relations shield. But as my decryption software hit 100% and the secondary vault cracked open, the horrific truth spilled across my screen. There was no urban revitalization. It was a massive predatory Ponzi scheme. I scrolled rapidly through the hidden ledgers. Calvin was using aggressive predatory lending tactics to force local business owners and families into foreclosure. Once the properties were seized, his shell corporations bought them for pennies on the dollar. But that was only the first layer of the rot. To avoid federal scrutiny and tax liabilities, he needed a clean way to wash the stolen cash. I cross-referenced the wire transfers and found the exact laundering mechanism. The money was being funneled directly through Chloe's nonprofit organization. My privileged, arrogant white sister-in-law ran an urban uplift charity that hosted lavish million-dollar galas under the guise of funding inner-city youth programs. The ledgers proved she was taking the illicit cash from Calvin's foreclosures, routing it through her charity as anonymous donations, and then transferring it to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Chloe was not just a complicit bystander wearing diamonds bought with dirty money. She was the primary money launderer for the entire operation. My fingers flew across the keyboard, downloading the evidence onto 3 separate encrypted servers. As I audited the final spreadsheet tracking the disbursements to Calvin's sons, I spotted a glaring mathematical discrepancy. My eyes narrowed. I ran the numbers again, matching the outgoing offshore wires against the internal family trust distributions. Trey was stealing from his own brother. Andre and Chloe were taking a massive cut for washing the money, but Trey, my spineless husband who slapped me to impress his father, was secretly siphoning millions off the top of Andre's share. He had created a ghost vendor in the charity's payroll, routing a solid 15% of the laundered funds into a hidden crypto wallet. He was robbing his own family blind. Before I could even process the magnitude of the leverage, I now held a loud notification pinged on my screen. It was an email from Calvin's lead attorney. The subject line read, "Urgent legal notice." I opened the message. Attached was a formal subpoena. Calvin was officially pressing felony assault charges against me for breaking Trey's fingers. He was aiming to put me behind bars before the sun came up, ensuring I could not speak to the police about the brutal beating Loretta endured. The body of the email was brief and dripping with corporate arrogance. It contained a settlement offer. Drop the medical proxy, sign a strict non-disclosure agreement, and walk away with $10,000. If I refused, I would face 10 years in a state penitentiary for aggravated assault and kidnapping. They wanted me to surrender my only protection for a payout that would barely cover a fraction of their designer wardrobes. I stared at the glowing screen, the audacity of their threat fueling the cold fury in my chest. They wanted to play legal games with a woman who held the digital keys to their entire criminal enterprise. I took a screenshot of the master ledger, explicitly highlighting the massive wire transfers moving from Chloe's charity directly into the offshore tax havens. I attached the single image to a reply email. I did not include any demands. I did not write a lengthy emotional paragraph defending my actions. I typed a single sentence, "See you at the deposition." I hit send, slamming the laptop shut. I packed my gear back into the tactical bag, checking the heavy deadbolt on the motel door one last time. Calvin thought he could bury me in legal paperwork and silence his wife before she could testify. He did not know that by trying to erase me, he had just triggered an avalanche that was going to bury his entire family under federal indictments. The sun was going to rise in a few hours, and I was going completely on the offensive. I navigated the dark labyrinth of the city streets, leaving the glittering downtown skyline in my rearview mirror. I drove for 40 minutes, taking random turns and doubling back through narrow alleys to ensure no private investigators or hired muscle were tailing my sedan. Calvin had the resources to mobilize a small army, but his men were used to tracking scared, helpless victims, not federal contractors trained in counter-surveillance. I steered my car into the cracked asphalt lot of the Starlight Inn. It was a decaying cash-only motel sitting on the forgotten edge of the industrial district, right beneath the roaring overpass of the interstate. It was exactly the kind of place where people went when they needed to disappear without a digital footprint. I walked into the dimly lit lobby and slid a crisp $100 bill across the scratched laminate counter. The night clerk, a tired older man watching a grainy television screen, did not ask for a name, an ID, or a license plate number. He just handed me a heavy brass key attached to a faded plastic tag. Room 114. Perfect. Second floor, end of the walkway with a clear line of sight to the stairs and the parking lot. I entered the room and immediately locked the deadbolt, fastening the heavy metal chain latch. I dropped my tactical bag onto the worn floral bedspread and went to work. I did not waste time crying over my ruined wedding night or the fact that my husband had just tried to render me homeless and penniless. I drew the heavy blackout curtains, completely shutting out the neon glare from the parking lot outside. I pulled a small electronic bug sweeper from my bag and quickly scanned the room for hidden cameras or audio transmitters. The device stayed silent. The room was clean. I sat down at the chipped particle board desk in the corner and pulled out my secondary laptop. This was not the sleek corporate machine I used when I went into the office to play the role of a diligent mid-level accountant. That version of me was the carefully constructed facade. Trey and his arrogant family honestly believed I was just a smart local girl who had worked her way up the corporate ladder. They thought I was a convenient diversity hire they could bully into submission and eventually use to rubber stamp their fraudulent tax returns. They thought I was desperate for their wealth, their validation, and their status. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. I was recruited out of Howard University during my senior year by a specialized division of the Treasury Department. For the past 6 years, I have operated as a ghost auditor for a highly classified federal financial crimes task force. We do not wear badges, and we do not carry standard-issue firearms. We carry algorithms. My daily job involves tearing down the complex digital fortresses of international drug cartels, corrupt oligarchs, and global money laundering syndicates. I bleed dirty money dry tracing invisible digital ink across borders until the most dangerous men in the world wake up to find their entire empires frozen. Calvin thought he was a terrifying predator because he owned some local politicians and a few dirty cops. To me, he was just another target on a very long list of arrogant men who thought they were untouchable. I booted up the encrypted terminal and plugged Loretta's heavy titanium flash drive into the secure port. The first layer of encryption had cracked in my car, revealing the offshore accounts, but that was just the surface. Loretta had managed to steal the deepest secrets of her husband's operation, and Calvin had hidden those secrets behind a military-grade cryptographic wall. A black command window opened on my screen, demanding a secondary authentication key. If I entered the wrong sequence or tried a standard bypass, the drive was programmed to execute a self-destruct protocol, wiping every byte of data permanently. Calvin had clearly hired serious dark web talent to build this vault. I cracked my knuckles and typed in a specialized decryption sequence I had designed for the task force. I watched the lines of code cascade down the black screen, launching a sustained algorithmic assault against the firewall. The laptop fan whirred loudly, working in overdrive as my program systematically dismantled the digital locks. I sat back and watched the progress bar inch forward. My lips still throbbed from where Trey had struck me, and my wedding dress was heavy with dried blood, but my mind was completely clear. I was in my element now. A harsh green light flashed across the screen. The secondary vault shattered. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, as massive, heavily encrypted spreadsheet files and PDF documents flooded my desktop. I opened the master directory labeled Acquisitions and Holdings. This was the holy grail of Calvin's entire corporate identity. He had spent decades branding himself as the savior of the city, buying up distressed properties in predominantly African-American neighborhoods and promising to build affordable housing and vibrant community centers. I pulled up the official city blueprints and cross-referenced them against the private internal ledgers Loretta had saved. I started clicking through the property addresses, checking the utility usage, the construction permits, and the tenant registries. Something was fundamentally wrong. The columns were padded with phantom figures. The numbers did not match the physical reality. I pulled up satellite imagery of 3 massive apartment complexes Calvin claimed to have fully renovated and populated last year, drawing millions in state subsidies and federal development grants. The satellite photos showed empty dirt lots and abandoned boarded-up brick buildings with collapsed roofs. I checked the tenant names listed on his rent rolls against federal tax databases and local municipal records. The tenants did not exist. The Social Security numbers were entirely fabricated, pieced together from deceased individuals and stolen identities. My eyes scanned the incoming cash flow statements, realizing the horrifying scope of what I was looking at. The millions of dollars pouring into his primary holding company were not coming from legitimate renters or commercial leases. They were staggered wire transfers from untraceable shell corporations, masking the origins of massive illegal operations. Howe was taking illicit cash, filtering it through these fake real estate developments, and bringing it out clean on the other side as rental income and government subsidy payouts. Calvin's pristine generational real estate empire was a complete and utter mirage. There were no thriving community centers or affordable housing units. It was nothing but a hollow, fraudulent front designed to wash dirty money on a breathtaking, staggering scale. I did not stop typing. The harsh glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark motel room as my fingers flew across the keyboard. My eyes scanned the scrolling data streams, processing the numbers with the cold precision that made me the top ghost auditor for the federal government. Calvin was not just cooking books to avoid taxes. He was orchestrating a massive predatory Ponzi scheme designed to systematically strip generational wealth from the most vulnerable people in our city. I pulled up the property deeds from his primary holding company and cross-referenced the addresses with public municipal records. A sickening pattern emerged instantly. Every single property was located in historically black neighborhoods. Calvin was targeting elderly African-American homeowners, people who had spent their entire lives paying off their mortgages. He used a network of corrupt local appraisers to artificially tank the value of their homes. Then his shadow lending firms would step in offering predatory reverse mortgages with buried balloon clauses that were mathematically impossible to pay back. When these families inevitably defaulted, Calvin swooped in, foreclosed on the properties, and seized the land for pennies on the dollar. He was actively destroying the legacy of his own people to line his silk pockets. But stealing the land was only the first step of the operation. He needed to show massive development to secure federal grants, and he needed a way to wash the millions in illicit cash he was generating from the illegal seizures. Dirty money is useless until you can explain to the IRS exactly where it came from. I opened the next encrypted folder labeled Disbursements and traced the digital paper trail. The money did not go straight to Calvin's personal accounts. It was funneled directly into a domestic nonprofit organization called the Urban Heritage Foundation. I leaned back in the creaky desk chair, feeling a surge of absolute disgust. The Urban Heritage Foundation was Chloe's charity. I thought about my white sister-in-law, standing in the hospital lobby just hours ago, dripping in diamonds and sneering at me. She had called my self-defense ghetto violence. She loved to parade around the city posing for magazine covers in her designer gowns, accepting awards for her tireless charitable work, uplifting underprivileged urban communities. She hosted million-dollar galas where rich politicians patted themselves on the back for donating to her cause. The reality burning on my screen proved her entire existence was a grotesque lie. Chloe was not a savior. She was the primary money launderer for a ruthless criminal syndicate. I dissected the charity's tax returns, comparing them against the hidden ledgers Loretta had managed to save. Chloe and Andre were taking the dirty money Calvin stole from foreclosed homes and logging it as anonymous philanthropic donations. Once the money was officially washed through the nonprofit tax shelter, Chloe wired it directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They were taking a massive 30% cut for running the wash cycle. Andre managed the corrupt domestic shell companies, while Chloe maintained the pristine public face, completely shielding the operation behind her unearned privilege and fake white savior complex. I cracked my knuckles and kept digging. I needed to map every single dollar before the sun came up. I downloaded the offshore routing numbers and ran them through a federal algorithm designed to track international wire transfers. The system worked quickly, matching the deposits landing in the Cayman accounts against the exact amounts leaving Chloe's charity. That was when my eyes caught a glaring irregularity. The numbers did not balance. Forensic accounting is not about looking at what is there. It is about looking at what is missing. I froze the scrolling data and zoomed in on the disbursement columns from the last 4 fiscal quarters. Every time Chloe authorized a transfer of washed funds to the offshore accounts, the final deposit was short. It was not a small accounting error. It was a consistent, precise deduction. Exactly 12% of the laundered cash was disappearing before it ever reached Calvin's offshore vault. Someone was siphoning the money. I isolated the missing funds and traced the fragmented digital signatures. The thief was smart. They had set up an automated ghost vendor within the charity's payroll system, disguising the diverted funds as legitimate consulting fees. The money was being bounced through 3 different domestic servers before finally landing in a decentralized anonymous cryptocurrency wallet. It was a beautiful piece of digital misdirection, but it was nothing I could not untangle. I extracted the IP address attached to the ghost vendor and cross-referenced it with the internal family emails stored on Loretta's drive. The IP address did not belong to Calvin. It did not belong to Andre or Chloe. It belonged to Trey. I stared at the glowing screen, a slow, ruthless smile spreading across my face. My cowardly, spineless husband, the man who slapped me to impress his tyrannical father, the man who threw my clothes into the hallway and gleefully threatened to leave me penniless on the street, was secretly robbing his own family blind. Trey was stealing millions of dollars directly from Andre and Chloe's cut of the laundering operation. I was too terrified to ever stand up to his father or his older brother in person, so he was quietly bleeding their illegal empire from the shadows. I had just found the exact weapon I needed to tear them apart from the inside. I downloaded the undeniable proof of Trey's embezzlement and prepared to leverage it. Before I could formulate my next tactical move, a loud notification pinged across my desktop. It was an email from Calvin's lead attorney demanding my immediate surrender. I did not panic. I stared at the message knowing I held the detonator to a bomb they did not even realize was ticking. The harsh knock on my motel room door was heavy and abrupt, cutting through the silence of the early morning. I froze my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I had disabled the GPS tracker on the corporate sedan hours ago, and my connection was routed through 3 encrypted international servers. Calvin could not have tracked my digital footprint, but he had enough money to flood the streets with private investigators who knew exactly which cheap cash-only motels to canvass. I quietly slipped a heavy metal flashlight from my tactical bag and stepped silently toward the door. I looked through the scratched peephole. It was not one of Calvin's oversized goons in a tailored suit. It was a bored-looking man in a cheap windbreaker holding a thick manila envelope. A process server. Calvin had mobilized his legal attack dogs faster than I anticipated. I unlatched the chain and opened the door just a fraction. The man did not even ask for my name. He shoved the heavy envelope through the crack, turned on his heel, and walked away down the exterior corridor without a single word. I locked the deadbolt and tore open the thick paper. The document inside was stamped with the official seal of the district attorney. It was a formal subpoena and a notice of impending criminal charges. The State versus Camille. Felony aggravated assault causing permanent bodily harm. Calvin had pulled his strings with his bought and paid for local politicians. He was using the 3 broken fingers I gave his cowardly son to paint me as a violent, unstable aggressor. They were actively pushing to have an arrest warrant executed before the sun fully rose, aiming to slap me in handcuffs and lock me in a holding cell where I could not speak to the police about the brutal beating Loretta had endured. I walked back to the chipped desk and tossed the subpoena next to my laptop. The screen was still glowing with the undeniable proof of Trey's massive embezzlement from his own brother's money laundering operation. Before I could even process my next strategic move, my secure inbox chimed with a new high-priority email. The sender was Preston Sterling, the ruthless lead counsel for Calvin's real estate holding group. The man was notorious in the city for burying whistleblowers in frivolous lawsuits and crushing low-income tenants who dared to fight Calvin's illegal evictions. I opened the message. The text was dripping with extreme corporate condescension and thinly veiled racial contempt. It was an ultimatum wrapped in legal jargon. Preston Sterling spelled it out with breathtaking arrogance. He stated that his client was willing to be exceptionally lenient given my troubled background in the foster care system. The terms were non-negotiable. I was to surrender the medical proxy and power of attorney for Loretta, immediately transferring all rights back to Calvin. I was to sign a blanket non-disclosure agreement, forbidding me from ever discussing the events that took place in the bridal suite. In exchange for my total silence and compliance, I would receive a lump sum settlement of $10,000 to help me start over. If I refused this generous offer, they would execute the arrest warrant for the malicious disfigurement of my husband. The email ended with a cold promise that I would spend the next 10 years in a state penitentiary where people of my demographic statistically belonged. $10,000. I stared at the glowing screen and let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed in the empty motel room. $10,000 was exactly what Calvin thought my silence was worth. It was what he thought Loretta's life was worth. He truly believed I was just some desperate, uneducated girl from the South Side who had tried to marry into money and was now being swatted away like a nuisance. He thought flashing the threat of prison and tossing a few $1,000s at me would make me drop to my knees and surrender. He forgot that I billed federal indictments against men who could buy and sell his entire pathetic operation before breakfast. I looked at the data completely populating my desktop. I looked at the offshore routing numbers, the fake tenant registries, the stolen generational land deeds, and the massive illegal tax shelters. Then I thought about Chloe, my privileged white sister-in-law, standing in the hospital lobby, covered in diamonds, bought with stolen money, sneering at me, and calling my self-defense ghetto violence. She loved to hide behind her pristine charitable foundation, playing the white savior, while she actively helped Calvin rob black families of their homes. I did not write a lengthy emotional reply defending my character. I did not beg Preston Sterling for mercy or try to negotiate a higher settlement. I operate on data and leverage. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the exact offshore routing ledger showing a $3 million wire transfer moving directly from Chloe's Urban Uplift charity into a hidden Cayman Island account registered under her maiden name. The image clearly displayed the date, the time, the exact amount, and the forged authorization signatures. It was undeniable ironclad proof of federal charity fraud and international money laundering. I attached that single image to my reply email. I did not include any demands. I did not explain how I bypassed their security or what other files I possessed. I knew exactly how these corrupt, arrogant men operated. Seeing that single screenshot would send a shockwave of absolute terror through Calvin's entire executive team. They would realize instantly that their impenetrable fortress had been breached and that I held the detonator. They would panic. They would need to contain me immediately before I walked into an FBI field office. I typed a single sentence in the body of the email, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Subject line: "See you at the deposition." I hit send. I watched the progress bar load and confirm delivery. I immediately shut the laptop down and began packing my tactical bag. The quiet phase of this war was officially over. I knew they would call an emergency closed-door deposition within the hour, trying to trap me in a room with their lawyers to force a surrender. They thought they were dragging a terrified, defenseless woman into an ambush. They had no idea I was walking in to burn their empire to the ground. The polished mahogany doors of Sterling and Associates law firm stood 12 feet tall, designed specifically to make anyone walking through them feel small and insignificant. I pushed them open without breaking my stride. I wore a sharp-tailored crimson pantsuit, my natural hair pulled back into a flawless, sleek bun. I left the blood-stained Vera Wang wedding dress in the trash exactly where it belonged. I walked past the shocked receptionist, ignoring her panicked demands that I sign the guest registry. I knew exactly which corner conference room they used for high-stakes intimidation. I pushed open the heavy glass double doors of the main boardroom. The air inside was thick with expensive cologne and suffocating arrogance. Calvin sat at the head of the massive granite table, looking like a king holding court over his subjects. To his right sat his eldest son, Andre, tapping an expensive fountain pen against his leather notepad. To his left sat Trey. My husband had his right arm wrapped in a heavy fiberglass cast, secured tightly to his chest in a dark blue sling. When he saw me walk into the room completely alone without a team of lawyers, a nasty, smug smile spread across his face. He actually thought I was showing up to surrender. He thought the threat of poverty had brought me to my knees. Sitting directly next to Andre was Chloe. She was sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass, her legs crossed perfectly. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a condescending, familiar smirk. I noticed exactly what was resting against her pale collarbone. It was Loretta's custom emerald-cut diamond choker. The heirloom piece had belonged to Calvin's grandmother. It was a piece of generational African-American history that Loretta wore to every major family event. Chloe caught me looking at the stones and let out a soft, theatrical laugh. She reached up and stroked the diamonds, intentionally flaunting her stolen prize. "Beautiful, is it not?" Chloe said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy and racial superiority. "Calvin told me to go ahead and get it out of the master safe this morning. Since Loretta is permanently indisposed and clearly unfit to handle the family business moving forward, Calvin is officially transferring her seat on the foundation board to me. It only makes sense that the family jewelry passes down to the woman who can actually handle the pressure of this lifestyle without acting out in a violent rage." I pulled out a heavy leather chair directly across from her and sat down. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my battered mother-in-law. I just smiled, a slow, chilling smile. "That necklace looks incredibly heavy, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You should be very careful. Wearing stolen property around your neck while running a fraudulent charity is a bold fashion statement. I prefer a simple watch myself, but to each their own." Andres' face turned bright red. He slammed his hand on the table, preparing to shout, but before he could speak, the boardroom doors swung open again. Preston Sterling marched into the room, followed by two nervous junior associates carrying thick briefcases. Preston was a man who charged $2,000 an hour to make federal investigations disappear for the city's most corrupt politicians. He dropped his briefcase onto the granite table with a loud, echoing thud and glared at me. "You have a lot of nerve walking in here unrepresented," Camille Preston snarled, leaning over the wide table to invade my personal space. "I saw your little email this morning. You think a doctored screenshot of a bank transfer scares us. We run this city. We own the judges you would try to present that fake evidence to. You are a low-level corporate accountant playing a game of chess against grandmasters. You have no idea how deep this water goes." I sat back in my chair, crossing my arms. "I know exactly how deep the water goes, Preston," I replied calmly. "The real question is whether or not you know how to swim." Preston unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. He slammed them down onto the table, sliding them aggressively across the smooth granite until they stopped right in front of my hands. It was a medical evaluation form, stamped with the official seal of a highly exclusive private psychiatric facility located just outside the city limits. I looked down at the bold printed letters. It was a signed declaration of severe mental incompetence. The forged document claimed Loretta was suffering from advanced early-onset dementia and severe psychotic delusions. It stated she had a long-hidden history of self-harm and completely lacked the legal capacity to sign any binding documents, including the medical proxy she gave me yesterday. Preston tapped his expensive gold pen against the fake evaluation. "We had a world-renowned psychiatrist examine Loretta's medical records this morning," Preston said, his voice radiating absolute triumph. "She is legally incompetent and highly unstable. Your power of attorney is entirely null and void. You are going to sign the surrender documents right now, hand over the proxy, and walk away with the $10,000, or I will have the police waiting in the lobby arrest you for medical kidnapping and extortion." Preston Sterling slid a heavy gold pen across the polished granite table. The pen rolled to a stop, right against my fingertips. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms with a look of supreme victory. He told me I had exactly 60 seconds to sign the relinquishment forms before he called the precinct commander he had on speed dial. Calvin sat at the head of the table, swirling his morning scotch, looking at me like I was a minor inconvenience he was finally scraping off his shoe. I did not pick up this pen. I picked up the psychiatric evaluation. I scanned the crisp white paper, ignoring the dense paragraphs of fabricated medical jargon detailing Loretta's supposedly declining mental state. I skipped straight to the bottom of the second page and read the signature line out loud. "Dr. Silas Montgomery." I read, letting the name hang in the tense air of the boardroom. "Chief of Psychiatry at the Whispering Pines Treatment Center." Preston tapped his watch. "Tick-tock, Camille." I set the paper down and looked directly into Preston's smug face. "You charge $2,000 an hour, Preston, and you did not even run a basic background check on the medical professional you are using to extort me. That is incredibly sloppy work for a managing partner." Preston's arrogant smile faltered just a fraction. He sat forward, planting his hands on the table. "The evaluation is ironclad," he snapped. "Dr. Montgomery is a highly respected specialist. Dr. Montgomery is currently under active federal investigation for 68 counts of aggravated Medicare fraud." I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "His medical license was suspended pending a federal indictment precisely 18 days ago. I know this because I am the person who audited his fraudulent billing records and submitted the referral to the Office of the Inspector General." The boardroom went dead silent. Andre stopped tapping his pen. Chloe's hand froze halfway to the stolen diamond necklace resting on her collarbone. Calvin narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening around his glass of scotch. Preston blinked, his legal mind scrambling to process the massive landmine he had just stepped on. "That is a bluff," he said, but his voice lacked the booming confidence from 3 minutes ago. "You are a mid-level accountant for a regional logistics firm. You do not have the clearance to audit federal medical billing." I smiled, a slow, calculated smile that made Trey shrink back into his chair. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the granite table, matching Preston's aggressive posture. "My day job is a carefully maintained cover, Preston," I said clearly. "I am a ghost auditor contracted by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network under the United States Treasury. My security clearance is higher than the federal judges you claim to own. I spent the last 3 weeks tracing millions of dollars in fraudulent medical billing from Silas Montgomery's clinic directly into a series of domestic shell companies. Shell companies that traced directly back to Calvin's holding group. I watched the blood drain entirely out of Preston's face. I did not give him a single second to recover. I went straight for the jugular. You just crossed state lines to present a forged medical document with a suspended provider's signature attempting to extort a legally binding power of attorney. I continued quoting the law with rapid-fire precision. Under Title 18 United States Code Section 1341, that is an overt act of wire and mail fraud. Because you presented it to me, a federally contracted auditor, attempting to obstruct a domestic violence in, you just triggered a Title 18 Section 1512 witness tampering charge. This is no longer a civil family dispute, Preston. You just walked your entire law firm into a racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's predicate offense. Calvin slammed his heavy fist onto the table, shaking the crystal water glasses. Preston handles, he bellowed, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. Shut her up and get that signature now. But Preston was not looking at Calvin. Preston was staring at me in sheer absolute terror. He was a ruthless lawyer who built a career bullying terrified whistleblowers and helpless tenants. He knew how to bribe local cops and manipulate state judges. But he also knew that federal financial auditors do not bluff. He knew that the IRS Criminal Investigation Division operates outside the realm of local political favors. If you push that piece of paper 1 inch closer to me, I told Preston, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper, I will trigger an immediate catastrophic IRS audit on Sterling and Associates by noon today. I will open up your client escrow accounts, your offshore retaining fees, and every single bribe you have logged as a consulting expense for the past 10 years. You will lose your law license, your firm, and your freedom before the sun goes down. Preston swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat rolling down his temple. He looked at the forged psychiatric evaluation sitting on the table like it was a live grenade. Then he looked at Calvin. You lied to me! Preston hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. You told me she was a desperate gold digger with no resources. You never told me she had federal credentials. You never told me Silas Montgomery was radioactive. I pay you to solve my problems, Calvin roared, standing up from his chair. Do your damn job. Preston did not obey. He reached out and snatched the forged evaluation off the table, shoving it aggressively into his briefcase. He did not care about Calvin's money anymore. He cared about his own survival. In the high-stakes world of corporate crime, lawyers protect themselves first and throw their clients to the wolves second. Preston snapped his briefcase shut with a loud, definitive click. He stood up, completely ignoring Calvin's enraged shouting. As of this exact moment, I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel, he announced, his voice shaking as he backed away from the table. Sterling and Associates no longer represents you or your family in any capacity. Do not contact my office. Do not call my private line. Preston turned and practically sprinted out of the boardroom, the 2 junior associates rushing frantically behind him. The heavy glass doors swung shut, leaving the room echoing with stunning silence. I sat perfectly still, looking across the wide granite table at my newly minted husband, his corrupt older brother, his racist sister-in-law, and his tyrannical father. They had walked into this room expecting to strip me of everything I had left. Instead, their most powerful weapon had just fled the building, leaving the family completely exposed and utterly defenseless against the woman they thought they could easily break. The heavy glass doors vibrated slightly in their frames long after Preston Sterling fled down the corridor. The silence inside the boardroom was absolute and incredibly heavy. Calvin stared at the empty space where his $2,000 an hour shark had just been sitting. His jaw locked so tight the muscle twitched visibly beneath his skin. Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hand dropping away from Loretta's stolen diamond necklace. Trey refused to look at me, keeping his eyes glued to the granite tabletop while cradling his freshly casted hand against his chest. They were completely paralyzed. I did not let them catch their breath. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single unmarked manila folder. I placed my palm flat against the cardboard and pushed it smoothly across the polished granite. It glided over the surface, stopping precisely inches from Andre's hands. I leaned back, crossing my legs, and looked directly at my brother-in-law. I know finding reliable legal counsel is going to be your primary concern this morning, Andre. I said, keeping my voice bright and highly professional. But as a forensic accountant, I felt a moral obligation to point out a rather massive administrative discrepancy in your current financial portfolio. I hate seeing family money mismanaged due to careless bookkeeping. Andre frowned, looking from the folder to his father. Calvin did not move. He was still trying to process how I had completely dismantled his legal shield. Andre tentatively opened the folder. Chloe leaned over his shoulder, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the armrest of his chair. The top page was the master spreadsheet I had decrypted at the motel. I had helpfully highlighted the specific disbursement columns in bright neon yellow marker. You and Chloe have been doing a remarkable job running the Urban Heritage Foundation. I continued, my voice echoing clearly off the mahogany walls. Washing foreclosed property assets through anonymous charity donations requires a lot of logistical oversight. It is exhausting work. It is perfectly understandable how you might miss a minor accounting error. Andres' face went entirely blank as he stared at the numbers. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth. I watched their eyes track the highlighted columns detailing the exact amounts moving from their domestic charity accounts to the Cayman Islands. They saw the deduction immediately. Exactly 12% was missing from every single wire transfer for the past 4 fiscal quarters. Millions of dollars simply gone into thin air. That is a ghost vendor, I explained helpfully, gesturing toward the paper. Someone embedded a phantom consulting fee into the charity's automated payroll. The funds bounced through 3 domestic servers before landing in an anonymous, decentralized cryptocurrency wallet. At first, I thought Chloe was just skimming a little extra off the top for her shopping sprees, but the IP address authorizing the transfers does not belong to her. I shifted my gaze slowly down the table, locking eyes with my husband. Trey was sweating profusely. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He pressed his back hard against his chair, trying to put as much distance between himself and the table as possible. The IP address belongs to the secure server in the penthouse. Trey and I shared, I stated, watching the bomb detonate in real time. It is registered to his personal encrypted device. Your little brother has been quietly robbing you blind for over a year, Andre. He has been taking 12% of your cut right off the top before the money even clears customs. The air in the room instantly turned toxic. Andre slowly turned his head to look at Trey. The older brother's eyes were wide with a violent, terrifying realization. Chloe jumped up from her seat, pushing her heavy leather chair over backward where it crashed onto the floor. "You stole from us!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Trey. "You stole millions of dollars from my foundation, you pathetic coward!" Trey pressed himself further into his seat, holding his broken fingers tightly against his chest. "Andre, I swear it is not what it looks like," Trey stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. "She is lying. She is just trying to turn us against each other because she knows she lost." "Look at the data I provided, Andre," I said calmly, cutting through Trey's desperate lies. The digital footprint is undeniable. The routing numbers match perfectly." Andre did not need to hear another word. The proof was staring him right in the face. With a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated rage, Andre vaulted directly across the wide granite conference table. He did not care about the expensive business suits or the pristine office environment. He tackled his younger brother, sending them both crashing heavily to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Trey screamed in absolute agony as Andre's full weight landed directly on his broken hand. Papers flew into the air, and crystal water glasses shattered against the hardwood floor, sending water and shards of glass everywhere. Chloe was shrieking, cheering her husband on while demanding her money back. Calvin lunged forward, shouting furiously and trying to physically pry his 2 adult sons apart. Blood from Trey's cast smeared across the floor as Andre threw a heavy punch connecting solidly with his brother's jaw. I remained seated in my chair, watching the entire arrogant cartel tear itself to bloody pieces. I did not lift a finger. I just watched them bleed. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. A sharp double buzz, signaling a priority message on my secure line. I pulled the device out and glanced at the screen. It was an urgent text from the sympathetic triage nurse I had befriended in the emergency room. My blood ran completely cold. I stood up immediately, pushing my chair back. The text message read, Calvin sent his private security team to the surgical wing. They are physically forcing the staff to sign release papers. They are moving Loretta right now. I left them bleeding on the boardroom floor. Andre had his hands wrapped tightly around Trey's throat, while Chloe shrieked in the background, demanding her stolen money back. Calvin was still shouting for security, his face a mask of purple rage. I did not stay to watch the rest of the carnage. I grabbed my tactical bag, pushed through the heavy glass doors, and hit the elevator button. The second the polished steel doors closed, cutting off the sound of my husband's desperate pleas for mercy, I broke into a dead sprint. I hit the underground parking garage, moving faster than I had in years. I threw my bag into the passenger seat of my sedan, slammed the door, and gunned the engine. The tires screeched violently against the concrete as I tore out of the facility, merging aggressively into the midday city traffic. My mind was calculating time, distance, and variables with cold clinical precision. The text from the triage nurse burned in my mind. Calvin was not just a corrupt businessman. He was a cornered predator facing the total collapse of his kingdom. He knew I had decimated his legal shield and exposed the deep rot inside his family. His immediate reaction was not to fight me in court, but to silence the only witness who could put him away for domestic violence before the financial crimes even hit the docket. Moving a patient fresh out of facial reconstruction surgery was a massive medical risk. It proved Calvin cared far more about keeping Loretta quiet than he did about keeping her alive. He intended to bury her in a private facility where his money dictated the visiting hours and the medication dosages. I weaved through the congested streets, running red lights and blasting my horn, warning every vehicle to get out of my way. I took corners so sharp the tires smoked against the asphalt. My knuckles were white, gripping the steering wheel. Loretta had waited 2 decades for an ally strong enough to help her tear down her abuser's empire. She had handed me the encrypted keys to his destruction while choking on her own blood. I was not going to let Calvin drag her back into the dark to be managed and erased. I pulled up to the emergency entrance of the hospital, abandoning my sedan directly in the ambulance bay. I ignored the shouting security guard, tossing my keys onto the pavement and sprinting through the sliding automatic doors. I bypassed the main triage desk, entirely utilizing the employee stairwell I had memorized during my previous visit. I took the steps 2 at a time, my breath burning in my lungs, my tailored crimson suit jacket flying open. I am trained to handle hostile environments, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins was raw and personal. I hit the 4th-floor surgical recovery wing and pushed hard through the heavy fire doors. The scene unfolding at the end of the long, sterile corridor made my blood run instantly cold. Calvin had not sent his standard corporate security. He had sent his fixers. 3 massive men in dark tailored suits were dominating the space outside Loretta's private room. 2 of them were leaning aggressively over the main nurse's station. They had a young, terrified floor nurse backed completely into a corner. Her hands were visibly shaking as she clutched a metal clipboard to her chest. One of the fixers was pointing a thick finger directly at her face, speaking in a low, menacing tone, demanding she sign off on an against medical advice transfer form. They were forcing her to forge a paper trail, claiming Loretta requested the transfer herself. Down the hall, the 3rd fixer was already in motion. He was pushing a heavy hospital gurney out of Loretta's room, heading straight for the service elevators at the back of the wing. I locked my eyes on the gurney. Loretta was strapped to the mattress. Her face was heavily bandaged, the bruising around her fractured orbital bone swelling grotesquely beneath the white gauze. She was semi-conscious, heavily sedated from the pain medication, her head lolling to the side. An IV pole rattled dangerously as the massive man shoved the bed forward with zero regard for her fragile medical state. They were taking her to an off-the-books private clinic, a place where Calvin paid the doctors to look the other way, where she would be locked in a medically induced coma until he figured out how to permanently solve his problem. It was a classic cartel tactic wrapped in a pristine healthcare facade. I did not shout for help. I did not look for a hospital administrator. I did not waste time threatening the men at the desk. I focused entirely on the asset they were trying to steal. I sprinted down the freshly waxed linoleum hallway, my heels clicking like rapid gunfire against the floor. The fixer pushing the gurney heard my approach and turned his head, his hand instinctively reaching inside his suit jacket. I expected a panicked family member or an angry, unarmed doctor trying to play the hero. He did not expect me. I closed the distance in a matter of seconds. I did not slow down. I stepped directly in front of the moving gurney, planting my feet squarely on the polished floor, shifting my center of gravity and blocking their exit completely. The largest of the three fixers did not even slow down his aggressive approach. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that strained tightly across his broad, heavy shoulders, and his face carried the blank, indifferent expression of a man who broke bones for a living. "Move aside, little girl," he growled, reaching a massive hand out to physically shove me out of the hallway. He fully expected me to flinch, to scream for security, or to cower against the cold linoleum wall like every other civilian he intimidated. He thought his physical presence was enough to clear the path. I did not move a single muscle. I planted my expensive heels firmly against the polished floor and let his heavy hand make direct contact with my crimson jacket. The second his thick fingers gripped my shoulder, I calmly reached into my interior pocket and pulled out my encrypted secure device. I did not raise my fists. Physical violence was Calvin's primitive language, and it was a chaotic, unpredictable game. I operated in a much higher currency. I traded in federal leverage. I hit a single speed dial button and put the phone on maximum speaker volume, holding it up right between my face and the fixer's chest. The line clicked open after a single ring. The deep, authoritative voice of Director Kendrick, the head of the United States Treasury Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, echoed loudly and clearly through the sterile hospital corridor. Camille, his voice barked, crisp and demanding, cutting through the tension. "Give me your exact status." I kept my eyes locked dead on the fixer, whose arrogant grip on my shoulder suddenly loosened. "Director Kendrick, I am currently standing on the fourth-floor surgical recovery wing of City General Hospital." I stated, my voice slicing through the ambient noise like a surgical blade. "I have 3 unidentified hostile operatives attempting to illegally transport a critical federal informant against severe medical advice. They are acting on direct orders from the primary target of our active racketeering investigation. I need immediate activation of a Priority 1 witness protection protocol." The fixer snatched his hand back as if my jacket had suddenly caught fire. His 2 partners, standing a few feet away by the nurse's station, instantly froze in their tracks. They were highly paid muscle hired to strong-arm terrified civilians and intimidate local underpaid beat cops. They were absolutely not contracted to assault federal ghost auditors on an open, unencrypted line with Washington. "Protocol is activated." Camille, Director. Kendrick responded without a single fraction of a second in hesitation. "I am dispatching 2 heavily armed tactical units to your exact GPS coordinates right now. They are 3 minutes out. Lock the floor down immediately. Do not let that patient leave the building under any circumstances." I ended the call and slipped the phone smoothly back into my pocket. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out my heavy brass federal contractor credentials, unfolding the leather wallet to display the silver badge. I turned my attention away from the stunned fixers and locked eyes with the hospital administrator, who had just stepped off the staff elevator drawn by the escalating commotion. "My name is Camille," I announced, holding the badge up high enough for the administrator and the terrified floor nurses to see clearly. "I am operating under strict federal jurisdiction. The patient strapped to this gurney is a protected witness in a highly classified federal money laundering and racketeering investigation. If she crosses the threshold of these double doors, your entire hospital network will be indicted by tomorrow morning for obstruction of justice and aiding an international criminal syndicate. I want a code silver initiated immediately. Lock this entire floor down right now." The hospital administrator turned chalk white. He did not ask any clarifying questions. He did not call Calvin's high-priced legal team to verify my claims. He took one terrified look at my federal credentials and slapped his hand hard against the emergency lockdown button mounted on the wall. A loud mechanical siren began to blare overhead, flashing bright red emergency lights down the corridor. Heavy steel security gates immediately dropped down from the ceiling over the elevator banks and the main stairwell exits, effectively sealing off the entire 4th floor. The unmistakable sound of electronic deadbolts sliding into place echoed around us. We were completely locked in. The 3 fixers exchanged a frantic, panicked look. They had completely lost control of the situation in less than 60 seconds. They knew Calvin's vast wealth could easily buy them out of a local kidnapping or assault charge, but absolutely nobody buys their way out of a federal witness tampering indictment. The lead fixer, the massive man who had grabbed my shoulder, took 2 rapid steps backward, holding his hands up in a gesture of total surrender. "We are just doing our job, lady," he muttered, his tough guy facade completely crumbling under the imminent threat of federal prison. "We do not want any trouble with the feds. We are walking away." "Then I suggest you disappear through the service corridors before my tactical units breach those fire doors and put you all in handcuffs," I replied, my gaze icy and unblinking. The 3 men did not need to be told twice. They abandoned the gurney immediately, sprinting down the corridor toward the secondary emergency exit, hoping to slip out through the laundry bays before the building was fully surrounded by government agents. They left their powerful boss high and dry, exactly as hired mercenaries do when the money is no longer worth the risk of a federal cage. I did not waste time watching them flee. I turned immediately back to the heavy metal gurney. The young floor nurse rushed forward, tears of relief streaming down her face, and began frantically unhooking the heavy leather straps the goons had used to restrain Loretta. Together we carefully rolled the hospital bed back into the safety of the private recovery room. The nurse quickly reattached the vital monitors and checked the intravenous lines, ensuring no physical damage had been done during the attempted abduction. I stood silently at the foot of the bed, watching the steady rhythmic rise and fall of Loretta's chest. Her face was a horrific canvas of deep purple and black bruising, but the heart monitor beeped with a strong, reassuring consistency. I had successfully secured the most important asset in this entire war. The heavy sedatives were finally beginning to wear off. Loretta's fingers twitched against the crisp white hospital sheets. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the blinding glare of the overhead surgical lights. She let out a sharp, ragged breath and slowly opened her uninjured eye. The room was perfectly quiet, save for the steady hum of the medical equipment. She looked past the nurse and focused her gaze directly on me, standing at the foot of her bed in my sharp crimson suit. She did not ask about Calvin. She did not ask about her cowardly son Trey or the violent chaos that had just unfolded outside her door. She did not shed a single tear over the brutal violence she had endured on the day of her son's wedding. Loretta swallowed hard, her voice a dry, raspy whisper that commanded the entire room. "Did you find the offshore accounts?" "I have every single account number," I answered, my voice steady as I looked into Loretta's uninjured eye. "Every shell corporation, every stolen deed, and every offshore wire transfer." A faint, fierce smile touched her bruised lips before the heavy hospital sedatives finally pulled her back under. I instructed the federal agents now stationed firmly outside her door to authorize 0 visitors under any circumstances. I took the staff elevator down to the subterranean parking garage to retrieve my backup drive from the trunk of my sedan. I needed to prep the final data package for Director Kendrick and ensure the digital chain of custody was flawless. The underground garage was a vast, echoing cavern of gray concrete and flickering fluorescent lights. My heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement, the sound bouncing off the damp walls. I was 10 yards away from my car when a figure stepped out from the shadows of a heavy concrete pillar. I instantly dropped my center of gravity into a defensive stance, my hand sliding directly toward the tactical pen in my jacket pocket. I expected another one of Calvin's massive fixers sent to finish the job. It was not a hired goon, it was Chloe. My hyper-privileged white sister-in-law looked absolutely unrecognizable. The pristine designer blowout she sported in the boardroom was a tangled, frizzy mess. Her expensive mascara was smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. The heirloom diamond choker she had boldly flaunted just hours ago was gone, likely pawned or hidden in a frantic panic. She was trembling violently, clutching a heavy leather designer tote bag to her chest, like a physical shield. She practically stumbled toward me, the arrogant sneer she wore in the hospital lobby completely erased from her face. "Camille, please," she gasped, her voice cracking with desperate manufactured panic. "Please, you have to listen to me for just 1 minute." I did not step back. I kept my hand deep in my jacket pocket, my thumb pressing firmly against the record button on my secure federal device. I let the hidden audio capture the echoing sound of her frantic, shallow breathing. I listened to you insult me in the lobby, Chloe. I stated, my tone radiating absolute sub-zero cold. I watched you wear a stolen necklace while defending a man who beats his wife. I think we are entirely out of things to discuss. She shook her head wildly, fresh tears spilling over her eyelashes. The racial superiority she wielded like a weapon had completely evaporated the exact second she realized she was facing real consequences. She dropped to her knees right there on the filthy oil-stained concrete floor. "They forced me," she sobbed, reaching out to grab the hem of my crimson pantsuit. "Calvin and Andre made me sign those charity documents. I did not know where the money was coming from at first. By the time I found out they were stealing from those neighborhoods, Andre threatened to ruin my reputation if I stopped washing the cash. I am a victim here too, Camille. You have to believe me." I looked down at her pathetic theatrical display. I knew the exact dates she authorized the transfers. I knew she actively selected which foreclosed properties to seize based on their proximity to gentrifying districts. "Get your hands off my suit," I commanded. She scrambled backward, frantically digging into her leather tote bag. She pulled out a small black electronic banking token. "I have my own money," she pleaded, her voice dropping to a frantic conspiratorial whisper. "Money Calvin and Andre do not know about." I skimmed it off the top of the charity accounts to protect myself. "There is $2 million in a clean, untraceable offshore account linked to this token. You can have it, all of it, right now." She held the device out to me, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it onto the pavement. "Just take the money, Camille, please. Wipe my name off the Urban Heritage Foundation ledgers on that flash drive before you hand it to the Treasury Department. $2 million. You can start over anywhere in the world. You never have to see this family again. Please, I cannot go to a federal penitentiary. I will not survive in there." I looked at the electronic token vibrating in her trembling hand. $2 million to erase a name. A few hours ago, Calvin's lawyer offered me $10,000 to walk away. The price of my integrity was apparently rising rapidly, but they all fundamentally misunderstood the woman standing in front of them. I did not reach for the token. I looked down at the woman who had built her entire socialite identity by stepping on the necks of vulnerable black families while playing the benevolent white savior on magazine covers. "You were not a victim when you were cashing those offshore wires." "Chloe," I said, my voice echoing sharply off the concrete walls. "You were not a victim when you called my self-defense ghetto violence. You loved the dirty money, you loved the unchecked power, and you loved looking down on people like me from your stolen penthouse." I took a deliberate step closer, forcing her to look up into my eyes. "I am not your corrupt husband. I am not your tyrannical father-in-law. I cannot be bought. I just recorded your entire $2 million felony bribery attempt on a federally secured device. When I hand this drive over to Washington, your name will be highlighted in bright, bold red." Chloe let out a devastating, breathless wail, dropping the banking token onto the concrete. She buried her face in her hands, completely shattered by the reality of her impending incarceration. I turned my back on her weeping form and took 2 confident steps toward my sedan. A sharp, unmistakable metallic click echoed through the empty parking garage. It was the distinct, heavy sound of a round being chambered. I froze mid-step, my military training instantly calculating the distance and angle. "Turn around very slowly, Camille." The voice was ragged, wet, and completely unhinged. I turned my head slowly. Stepping out from behind a concrete pillar 20 feet away was Trey. My husband looked like a wild, cornered animal. His right arm was still bound in the heavy fiberglass cast I had put him in, but his left hand was raised straight out in front of him. His fingers were wrapped tightly around the grip of a black semi-automatic handgun, and the dark barrel was pointed directly at the center of my chest. The harsh metallic click of a round sliding into the chamber echoed loudly off the damp concrete walls of the underground parking garage. Chloe let out a terrified shriek. She did not stay to defend her brother-in-law or beg for her stolen money. She dropped her designer bag and sprinted toward the exit stairwell, her heels clattering frantically until the heavy metal fire door slammed shut behind her. I did not run. I turned my head slowly, squaring my shoulders to face the threat. Trey stepped fully into the flickering overhead fluorescent light. My husband of 24 hours looked completely unhinged. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His right arm, the one I had brutally fractured in the bridal suite, was bound in a heavy fiberglass cast and strapped tightly across his chest. He was holding a black semi-automatic handgun in his left hand. His non-dominant hand. The weapon was trembling so violently his finger kept slipping against the trigger guard. "Give me the drive, Camille," he shouted, his voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of rage and sheer terror. "Give me the drive right now, or I swear to God I will drop you right here. My father said you would try to run. He said you were a traitor." I looked at the heavy steel barrel pointed directly at the center of my chest. Most people would drop to their knees and beg for their lives. But growing up in the foster care system, navigating the violent corners of the city, long before I ever saw the inside of a corporate boardroom, taught me how to read a threat. A cold-blooded killer holds a weapon steady. A terrified little boy trying to win his daddy's approval shakes. Trey was shaking so hard he could barely keep the gun leveled. I did not raise my hands. I did not step back. I took a slow, deliberate step directly toward him. "You think holding a gun makes you Calvin?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "You are holding a deadly weapon with your non-dominant hand because I broke your primary one. You are sweating through your expensive shirt and you are hyperventilating. You could not hit a stationary target at this distance if your life depended on it." "Stay back!" Trey screamed, taking a clumsy step backward. His cast bumped awkwardly against his chest, causing him to wince in pain. "I am the vice president of the holding group. I am taking over the entire operation. I will pull this trigger. I will do whatever it takes to protect my family." "You are protecting absolutely nothing," Trey, I said, taking another measured step forward. "Your family is already dead. I decrypted the offshore ledgers an hour ago. I saw the phantom vendor you embedded in the charity payroll system. 12% skimmed right off the top of Andre and Chloe's laundering operation. Millions of dollars funneled directly into your decentralized cryptocurrency wallet." The color completely drained from Trey's face. The gun dipped a fraction of an inch as my words hit him. He honestly thought he was a criminal mastermind. He thought he was playing a brilliant shadow game behind his father's back. I was about to shatter his entire reality. "You actually believed Calvin did not know?" I continued, my tone radiating absolute sub-zero contempt. "You think a ruthless man who controls a multi-million-dollar real estate racketeering syndicate just missed millions bleeding from his own secondary accounts? You think a man who beats his own wife to maintain total control just overlooked your little side hustle?" Trey swallowed hard, his chest heaving. He told me I was the smart one. He stammered, a desperate plea for validation leaking into his voice. He said Andre was too hot-headed. He said I was the future of the empire. "I told you to know your place," I corrected sharply, bringing up the exact words he used when he slapped me in the bridal suite. "Calvin let you steal that money, Trey. He watched you route those stolen funds into your digital wallet and he smiled. Do you know why? Because 3 years ago when he promoted you to vice president, he registered the master holding corporation entirely under your social security number. He made you the primary signatory on every single fraudulent Delaware shell company." Trey's eyes widened in sheer horror. The gun wavered drastically, now pointing down toward the concrete floor. "When the federal indictments come down, and they are coming down by tomorrow night, the paper trail does not lead to Calvin," I explained, breaking down his demise with cold forensic precision. "The federal asset forfeiture does not trace back to Andre. It bypasses them completely and drops the entire predatory lending scheme, the massive tax evasion, and the international wire fraud squarely onto your lap. You are not his heir, Trey. You are his human shield. He set you up to take the fall for a 20-year federal prison sentence so he could walk away completely clean." No, Trey whispered, a single tear spilling over his eyelashes. "No, my father loves me. We are blood. He let you slap me to prove your pathetic loyalty, knowing he was going to feed you to a federal judge to save his own skin," I stated, taking the final step forward until I was standing inches from the barrel of the gun. "You are holding a weapon to protect a man who has already signed your prison sentence. You threw my clothes into the hallway and laughed at me while your father was busy digging your grave." Trey stared at me, completely paralyzed by the devastating magnitude of his own foolishness. The physical pain from his broken fingers and the crushing emotional weight of his father's ultimate betrayal broke him entirely. He let out a ragged, suffocating sob. The little boy, desperate for Daddy's approval, was completely destroyed. I reached out calmly and wrapped my fingers securely around the cold steel barrel of the handgun. He did not pull the trigger. He did not resist me at all. I pried the weapon smoothly from his trembling, sweaty grip. I ejected the magazine with a sharp click and pulled the slide back, clearing the chamber. The single heavy bullet clattered uselessly against the pavement. I walked over to a heavy iron grate covering a deep storm drain a few feet away. I dropped the gun and the loaded magazine straight through the rusted metal bars. They splashed heavily into the dark rushing water far below, completely unrecoverable. I turned back to look at the man I had married. Trey collapsed onto his knees right there on the filthy oil-stained concrete floor. He buried his face in his good hands, sobbing openly and uncontrollably, mourning the death of an empire that was never truly his. I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. I turned my back on him and walked toward my car, leaving him weeping alone in the dark. I had a stage to prepare for tomorrow night, and I was going to make sure Calvin burned in front of the entire city. I left the parking garage without a single backward glance. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead as the muffled sound of a grown man weeping echoed off the damp concrete walls. I had zero sympathy for a coward mourning the sudden violent death of his own unearned entitlement. I took the service elevator back up to the fourth-floor surgical recovery wing. The heavy steel security gates were still firmly locked down from my Federal Code Silver Command. Two heavily armed federal agents from my Financial Crimes Task Force now stood flank on the heavy wooden door to the private suite. I flashed my brass credentials and they stepped aside seamlessly. The hospital room was perfectly quiet, save for the rhythmic, steady hum of the heart monitor. Loretta was sitting up slightly against the crisp white pillows. The severely bruised and swollen side of her face stood in stark, jarring contrast to the fierce, unyielding clarity shining in her good eye. She did not look like a helpless victim anymore. She looked like a commanding general aggressively mapping out a battlefield. I pulled a vinyl chair to the edge of her mattress and opened my secure secondary laptop, turning the bright screen so she could see the decrypted offshore ledgers. I found absolutely everything I told her, keeping my voice low and strictly professional: the illegal shell companies, the predatory real estate seizures targeting vulnerable families, the massive charity wash cycle, and the exact digital paper trail where Calvin deliberately set Trey up to take the fall for a 20-year federal racketeering bid. Loretta let out a bitter, raspy breath that rattled in her injured chest. He always intended to sacrifice the weak son to protect his golden child. She whispered, her voice rough but entirely steady. Andre is his true heir. Calvin is making the transition official tomorrow night. She methodically laid out the timeline for their ultimate destruction. Tomorrow was the annual Legacy Gala, hosted at the Grand Magnolia Hotel. It was the most exclusive, highly publicized social event of the year for the city's wealthy, black elite and old money political donors. Calvin was planning to use the extravagant black tie event to formally announce his candidacy for the state senate and publicly pass the presidency of his fraudulent real estate holding group directly to Andre. He wants to stand in front of the mayor, the city council, and every major media outlet to paint himself as the grand savior of our community, Loretta said, gripping the edge of her thin hospital blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. He wants to smile for the cameras while he systematically robs our people blind and brutally beats his wife behind closed mahogany doors. I nodded, my mind already calculating the complex tactical logistics. We could easily hand the decrypted files directly to Director Kendrick tonight and let the federal raid happen quietly in the morning. But a quiet arrest was absolutely not what Loretta wanted, and a quiet arrest was not what Calvin deserved. He had built his tyrannical empire on public perception manipulation and vicious racial exploitation. We had to burn that exact perception to ash in front of the very people he desperately sought to impress. We broadcasted, I stated, tapping the edge of my laptop keyboard. We take the master offshore ledger, the wire transfers routing through Chloe's fake charity, and the security footage from the bridal suite. We hijack the teleprompter and the main presentation screens during his keynote speech. We let his wealthy donors and his political allies watch his entire empire bleed out in high definition. Loretta's good eye gleamed with a dangerous, highly satisfying light. "Break him," she ordered. There was only one massive tactical problem standing between us and total victory. The Grand Magnolia Hotel operated like an impenetrable fortress during high-profile political events. Calvin had already mobilized his private security firm to lock down the entire perimeter. My federal task force commanders were securing the sealed arrest warrants, but they could not breach the venue until the exact moment I triggered the digital broadcast. If the feds moved in too early, Calvin would activate his wipe protocols and destroy the evidence on his personal devices. I needed to be physically inside the central audiovisual control room to deploy the payload and bypass their internal network security. I pulled up the venue's security schematics on my screen, tracing the access routes. My face, my name, and my vehicle plates were already flagged at every single entrance, service elevator, and loading dock. Calvin had explicitly instructed his armed guards to detain me on site if I came within a mile of the gala. I could not just walk through the front doors in an evening gown, and I could not fight my way through a dozen heavily armed men without completely compromising the federal operation. I stared at the flashing red security alerts on my screen mapping the impossible perimeter. I needed an invisible Trojan horse. I needed a verified VIP guest to walk me right past the heavy security detail and smuggle me directly into the control room without raising a single red flag. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, parked in the shadows 3 blocks from Chloe's sprawling suburban estate. I pulled up the audio file on my encrypted phone. The recording was flawless. The sound of her sobbing, begging me to take $2 million to erase her name from the money laundering ledgers echoed in the quiet interior of my car. I attached the audio file to an encrypted direct message and sent it to her personal number. I did not include a greeting, I just waited. Exactly 40 seconds later, my phone lit up with an incoming call. "What do you want?" Chloe hissed, her voice strained and frantic. I heard the sound of a door locking in the background. She was hiding from Andre, terrified he would hear her panic. "I want the master access codes for the Grand Magnolia Hotel," I stated, my voice radiating absolute zero. "You are the chairwoman of the Legacy Gala Planning Committee. You have unimpeded all-access security clearance. You are going to leave a master keycard and a floor schematic taped underneath the lid of the secondary recycling bin by the catering loading dock at exactly 6 o'clock tomorrow evening." "I cannot do that," Chloe gasped. "Calvin has elite private security covering every single entrance. They have your photograph on a blacklist. If they catch me smuggling you inside, they will kill me, Camille. If you fail to leave that keycard, I will forward this audio recording directly to my task force commander before the appetizers are served," I replied coldly. "You will be arrested for federal charity fraud and international money laundering in front of the mayor, the city council, and every wealthy donor you rely on for your fake white savior philanthropy. You have 24 hours to decide which cage you want to live in." I hung up the phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I knew exactly what she would choose. Self-preservation was the only loyalty Chloe actually possessed. The next evening, the Grand Magnolia Hotel was entirely locked down. Calvin's private security team patrolled the perimeter in dark suits with earpieces, scrutinizing every guest stepping out of the line of Blacktown cars. The local media was camped out by the velvet ropes, eager to cover the highly anticipated announcement of his state Senate campaign. Calvin was about to position himself as the grand political savior of the very same African-American communities he was systematically robbing blind. I did not attempt to walk through the front doors. I wore a crisp black uniform identical to the catering staff. My natural hair was pulled back into a tight, unnoticeable knot. I walked down the dimly lit alley behind the hotel, completely blending in with the working-class people Calvin pretended to champion but secretly exploited to build his empire. I reached the secondary recycling bin near the loading dock. I ran my hand under the heavy plastic lid. My fingers brushed against a thick plastic card taped securely to the rim. Chloe had folded. I pulled the master keycard down and swiped it against the digital reader on the service entrance door. The light flashed green. The heavy metal door clicked open. I stepped into the bustling, chaotic underbelly of the hotel. The smell of roasted filet mignon and expensive champagne permeated the humid air. Dozens of waiters and kitchen staff rushed past me carrying massive silver trays. I kept my head down, clutching a blank clipboard, walking with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone who belonged there. I navigated the labyrinth of service corridors, using the mental map I had memorized from the schematic. I reached the base of the employee stairwell that led directly to the mezzanine level. I pushed the door open and nearly collided with Chloe. She was pacing the small concrete landing, wearing a stunning emerald green evening gown, dripping in new diamonds. When she saw me, her face lost all its color. She looked absolutely terrified, trembling as she glanced nervously up the stairs toward the main event space. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg me for mercy, or perhaps to negotiate a new deal. I did not stop walking. I did not look at her. I simply shoved my shoulder roughly past her, freezing her into silence. She knew better than to cause a scene that would draw the guards. I took the stairs two at a time, leaving her shivering in the stairwell. The mezzanine level overlooked the grand ballroom through a wall of tinted soundproof glass. The audiovisual control room sat at the very end of the corridor. I swiped the stolen master keycard again. The door unlocked and I stepped inside the nerve center of the entire gala. Two hotel tech directors were sitting in front of a massive bank of glowing monitors, actively monitoring the live camera feeds and the microphone levels. They spun around in their rolling chairs, startled by my sudden entrance. I did not give them a second to question my uniform. I pulled my heavy brass federal contractor badge from my pocket and held it up high. Treasury Department Financial Crimes Division, I barked, my voice sharp and deeply authoritative. We have a credible wiretap threat targeting the senator-elect. Clear this room immediately for a mandatory 10-minute diagnostic sweep. The two technicians took one look at the federal badge and scrambled out of their chairs. They did not ask for a warrant. People rarely argue with federal authority when it is delivered with total aggressive confidence. They hurried out into the hallway, closing the door behind them. The second the latch clicked, I engaged the heavy deadbolt. I grabbed a thick steel folding chair and wedged it tightly beneath the door handle, creating an impenetrable barricade. I turned to the master control console. Through the wide glass window, I had a perfect, unobstructed aerial view of the grand ballroom below. 400 of the city's wealthiest, most influential elites were taking their seats at tables adorned with massive floral centerpieces. I pulled Loretta's encrypted titanium flash drive from my pocket. It felt incredibly heavy, carrying the weight of 20 years of domestic abuse and generational theft. I plugged the drive directly into the main server bank. I rapidly bypassed the hotel's basic network security and routed my output directly into the primary video matrix. I linked the files to the massive digital screens flanking the main stage and overrode the teleprompter feed. Down in the ballroom, the crystal chandeliers dimmed. The orchestral music swelled to a triumphant crescendo. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, introducing the man of the hour. Calvin strode confidently onto the stage. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, his chest puffed out with supreme arrogance. He smiled a blinding practice smile, waving graciously to the standing ovation of politicians and donors who were unknowingly funding his criminal syndicate. He walked up to the podium, gripped the polished mahogany edges, and looked down at the teleprompter to begin reading his triumphant campaign speech. He had absolutely no idea what I had just loaded onto his screen. I dragged a heavy steel folding chair across the carpeted floor of the audiovisual room and wedged the top rail firmly under the brass handle of the heavy wooden door. I kicked the base of the chair, locking it perfectly into a 45-degree angle against the concrete floor. No one was getting into this control room without a battering ram. I turned back to the massive glowing mixing console. Through the wide tinted soundproof glass overlooking the grand ballroom, I had the ultimate vantage point for the execution. Down below the opulent space was a sea of glittering wealth. 400 of the city's most influential African-American leaders, pastors, local politicians, and wealthy business owners were seated at tables draped in imported silk. Waiters in white gloves poured vintage champagne into crystal flutes. The lighting was soft and golden, reflecting off the massive floral centerpieces. Calvin stood at the mahogany podium, positioned perfectly between two massive digital projector screens displaying his sleek new campaign logo. He adjusted his custom silk tie and leaned into the microphone. His deep, booming baritone voice echoed powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system filling the cavernous room. "We are gathered here tonight, not just to celebrate a successful business." Calvin began, his voice dripping with practiced magnetic charisma. "We are here to celebrate family. We are here to celebrate the enduring strength of our community. For decades, I have made it my personal mission to build generational wealth for our people, to protect our neighborhoods, to uplift our vulnerable youth, and to honor the strong, beautiful women who stand beside us and hold our families together." The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his words tasted like battery acid. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Some of the older guests actually stood up clapping passionately for the man they believed was their greatest champion. I watched Andre sitting at the VIP table near the front, puffing out his chest with unearned pride. Chloe sat right next to him, smiling a stiff, terrified smile while nervously scanning the room for any sign of federal agents. I looked down at the master control board. My fingers rested lightly on the digital sliders. I let Calvin soak in the applause for exactly 10 more seconds. I let him reach the absolute highest pinnacle of his fraudulent, glorious moment. Then I hit the master override switch. I instantly killed the primary microphone feed, cutting Calvin's booming voice off mid-sentence. A sharp burst of static crackled through the ballroom speakers. Down on the stage, Calvin tapped the microphone, frowning in annoyance, signaling for the sound engineers to fix the glitch. He looked down at his teleprompter to read his next line. The scrolling political speech on his prompter vanished. It was replaced by a single bold red sentence I had typed into the system. It read, "You should have checked the offshore ledgers, Calvin." Before Calvin could even process the words on the screen, I engaged the primary video matrix. The two massive digital screens flanking the stage flickered wildly. The sleek campaign logos disappeared. They were instantly replaced by crystal-clear, high-definition hospital security footage. It was the raw, unedited video from the fourth-floor surgical recovery wing. The giant screens broadcasted Calvin in his tailored suit violently shoving Loretta against the nurse's station desk. The footage clearly showed his massive hand gripping her neck, completely exposing the brutal domestic abuser hiding behind the philanthropic mask. The entire ballroom went completely dead silent. The lively chatter, the clinking of silver forks against fine china, the soft jazz playing in the background, it all stopped instantly. 400 people sat frozen, staring up at the massive screens in sheer, absolute horror. Calvin turned around slowly, his face draining of all color as he saw himself brutalizing his wife in high definition. He stood frozen at the podium, his arrogant facade shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I did not give the crowd time to process the violence before I dropped the next bomb. I pushed the main audio slider all the way up and hit play on the encrypted sound file. The crystal-clear audio of Chloe begging me in the concrete parking garage blared through the massive surround sound speakers. "They forced me." Chloe's frantic, sobbing voice echoed through the silent ballroom. "Calvin and Andre made me sign those charity documents. I have $2 million in a clean, untraceable offshore account. You can have it. All of it. Right now. Just wipe my name off the Urban Heritage Foundation ledgers before you hand it to the Treasury Department. Please, I cannot go to a federal penitentiary." Down in the audience, heads snapped aggressively toward the VIP table. Andre stared at his wife, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He realized in that exact moment that Chloe had not only admitted to federal charity fraud on a recorded line, but she had happily thrown him and his father directly under the bus to save her own skin. Chloe buried her face in her hands, physically shrinking into her chair as the furious gazes of the city's elite locked onto her. But I was not finished. The audio recording faded out and I triggered the final payload. The massive projector screens shifted from the security footage to a rapid scrolling display of Calvin's highly classified internal financial spreadsheets. I had specifically programmed the presentation to highlight the names and addresses of the foreclosed properties. The screens flashed the stolen generational land deeds right alongside the illegal wire transfers, proving exactly where the money went. The crowd was no longer silent. A low, dangerous rumble began to build in the back of the room and rapidly swept forward. The pastors, the local business owners, and the community leaders sitting at those tables were watching their own stolen properties and their own missing charity donations scroll across the giant screens. They saw the exact mathematical breakdown of how Calvin had systematically robbed their neighborhoods blind to fund his luxury lifestyle and his political campaign. The collective shock instantly morphed into a visceral, explosive rage. A prominent local pastor stood up, kicking his heavy dining chair backwards so hard it crashed to the floor. "You stole from the community center," he roared, his voice echoing across the cavernous space. "You stole from our children, you parasitic fraud." Absolute pandemonium erupted. Dozens of guests surged to their feet, shouting furiously and pointing accusing fingers at the stage. The elegant black tie gala instantly devolved into a volatile, hostile riot. A heavy crystal champagne flute sailed through the air, hurled by an outraged donor in the front row. The glass shattered violently against the mahogany podium right near Calvin's feet, sending sharp shards flying across the polished wood. Calvin stumbled backward, raising his arms to shield his face from the raining glass and the blinding spotlight. The powerful, untouchable king of the city was completely exposed, entirely stripped of his wealth, his power, and his impenetrable legal armor. He looked out at the furious mob of people he had exploited for decades surging toward the stage. Panic finally overtook his legendary arrogance. He spun around, abandoning the podium, abandoning his political aspirations, and abandoning his family, making a desperate panicked dash toward the dark side exit of the stage. Calvin shoved blindly through the heavy velvet curtains draped behind the main stage. He knocked a terrified catering manager out of his way, sending a tray of expensive appetizers crashing to the hardwood floor. The booming roar of the furious crowd echoed behind him, vibrating through the thick walls of the Grand Magnolia Hotel. He was sweating profusely, his custom tuxedo jacket completely ruined, his meticulously crafted public image completely shattered. He sprinted down the service corridor, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically against the polished tiles. He burst through the double doors leading directly into the opulent main lobby. He reached desperately into his pocket for his phone, intending to call his private pilot and demand immediate extraction. He thought he had outrun the blast radius. He thought his immense wealth could still buy him a silent escape into the night. I was dead wrong. The towering brass and glass entrance doors of the hotel did not just open. They were violently breached. Over 30 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear, bearing the gold letters of the Treasury Department, swarmed into the lobby. Director Kendrick led the strike team, his federal badge gleaming brightly against his tactical vest. Calvin froze, completely paralyzed, as the blinding tactical flashlights pinned him directly against the imported marble walls. He raised his hands instinctively, but his arrogance refused to die quietly. He shouted at the federal agents, demanding to know who authorized this raid, screaming that he personally funded the mayor's re-election campaign and owned the chief of police. Director Kendrick did not even break his stride. He grabbed Calvin by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo and slammed him brutally against the cold marble pillar. The sickening thud of the billionaire's shoulder hitting the stone echoed through the cavernous lobby. Kendrick kicked Calvin's legs apart, forcing him into a humiliating position of total submission, right in front of the horrified hotel concierge staff. "You do not own anyone anymore," Calvin Kendrick stated, his voice cutting through the lobby like a steel blade. "You are under arrest for federal racketeering, international money laundering, and domestic terrorism. You have the right to remain completely silent, and I highly suggest you use it." The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around Calvin's wrists, locking his hands behind his back. But the federal sweep was not contained to the lobby. Tactical teams were already flooding the grand ballroom, systematically locking down every single exit. Inside the chaotic event space, Andre grabbed Chloe roughly by the arm, trying to drag her toward the kitchen fire escape. Chloe was hysterical, shrieking at the top of her lungs, her expensive emerald green evening gown dragging through spilled champagne and broken crystal. She tried to pull her ultimate card of privilege, screaming at the federal agents that she was a wealthy, innocent victim, that her powerful family would sue the entire government for harassment. A female federal agent did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She grabbed Chloe firmly by the shoulder, spinning her around and pressing her face flat against the mahogany wall. Chloe sobbed wildly, demanding her personal lawyer, crying that she was forced into washing the money. The cold metal cuffs snapped sharply over her wrists, instantly silencing her threats. Andre tried to shove a different agent out of his way, attempting to flee, but he was swiftly tackled to the carpeted floor, his face pressed directly into the spilled wine. Deep inside the venue, hiding behind the massive mahogany bar, they found Trey. My spineless, cowardly husband had not even tried to run. He had crawled into the dark space beneath the liquor cabinets, curling his large frame into a pathetic shaking ball. He was hyperventilating, cradling his heavily casted hand, rocking back and forth in a puddle of melted ice. When the agents hauled him to his feet, he immediately started weeping, begging them not to hurt his broken fingers, blaming his father and his brother for every single fraudulent shell company. He sold his entire family out before they even read him his Miranda rights. The agents dragged the entire corrupt syndicate out into the main lobby, forcing them to march together through the brightly lit foyer. The local media, who had gathered outside to cover Calvin's political announcement, were now eagerly filming the ultimate billionaire perp walk. Camera flashes blinded them, capturing their absolute humiliation for the morning news cycle. As Calvin was being shoved roughly toward a waiting armored federal transport vehicle, he stopped struggling. He lifted his head, his furious eyes scanning the grand mezzanine level towering high above the lobby floor. I was standing perfectly still behind the tinted soundproof glass of the audiovisual control room. I looked down at the man who had ordered his goons to hunt me, who had beaten his wife for decades, and who had stolen millions from the most vulnerable families in the city. Calvin locked eyes with me through the glass. He finally realized the true catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply raised my hand and gave him a slow, deliberate, mocking wave goodbye. 3 months later, the dust had finally settled over the city. The federal prosecution case against the real estate empire was absolutely bulletproof thanks entirely to the decrypted offshore ledgers and the pristine digital chain of custody I had handed directly to Director Kendrick. Calvin, Andre, and Trey were all denied bail labeled extreme flight risks due to their offshore resources. They were currently sitting in a federal holding facility, facing a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Chloe met an equally devastating fate. Her wealthy old money white family took one horrifying look at the viral video of her screaming bribery attempt and immediately moved to protect their own pristine reputation. They publicly disowned her, severing her access to their generational trust funds and leaving her to face the federal charity fraud indictment, completely reliant on an overworked public defender. She was trading her designer gowns for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. My legal ties to the syndicate were severed with clinical speed. Using the overwhelming evidence of fraud and extreme domestic violence, I secured a rapid legal annulment. The marriage to Trey was officially erased from all public records, as if that bloody, horrific wedding night had never even happened. The greatest victory, however, belonged to Loretta. The severe bruising on her face had faded completely, revealing a woman who had reclaimed her entire existence. She looked radiant walking into the federal courthouse, completely free from the crushing weight of a 20-year abusive nightmare. Armed with the power of attorney and the hidden evidence she had bravely salvaged, she took absolute control of the remaining clean assets in the civil settlement. She systematically liquidated Calvin's legitimate commercial properties and began actively donating the millions back into the specific communities he had spent decades defrauding. She was building real, tangible community centers, providing massive grants to local Black-owned businesses and ensuring that the generational wealth stayed exactly where it belonged. She had survived the monster, and now she was using his own money to heal the city he tried to destroy. I walked through the heavy glass doors of my newly upgraded corner office at the Federal Task Force headquarters. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the polished mahogany desk and the crisp federal seals hanging on the walls. I set my briefcase down and walked over to the wide glass panes, looking out at the sprawling city skyline below. The corrupt empire that once cast a dark shadow over those streets had been completely eradicated. They thought I was just an ordinary girl they could slap into submission and toss into the gutter. They completely underestimated the quiet, observant women who operate in the shadows. They handed the match directly to the woman who gladly burned their entire house to the ground. The greatest lesson to draw from this story is that true power does not reside in loud threats, expensive suits, or generational wealth built on the exploitation of others. True power lies in maintaining unwavering clarity and unshakable composure when the people you trust attempt to break you. When you are confronted with sudden betrayal, especially from those who claim to be family, your immediate instinct might be to panic or surrender to their overwhelming pressure. However, this narrative teaches us the vital importance of knowing your own worth and refusing to be diminished by someone else's arrogance. Toxic family systems rely heavily on silence intimidation and the false belief that their victims have nowhere else to go. By methodically dismantling her abuser's empire, the protagonist demonstrates that you should never let anyone strip away your dignity or manipulate your reality. Establishing ironclad boundaries and standing firmly in your truth is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Ultimately, the story reminds us that those who underestimate your intelligence and resilience are simply handing you the exact tools you need to build your own justice and walk away completely free. If you have ever had to break free from a toxic environment and reclaim your own power, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your story of triumph in the comments below.